We're doing now Parshas Vayera. If you want to follow, it starts on page 78. And as always, you don't have to follow inside, but but I'll refer to where we are if you'd like to. We begin by saying Vayera elav Hashem be'alonim Mamre. It says that Hashem appeared to him among the, it says here, plains of Mamre, but it was Mamre was a fellow who owned this land. And he was a friend of Avram's, and this is where Avram was sitting. Now, of course, it doesn't tell us who he is. We know, because we've read the whole story, but it doesn't tell us for at least 6 verses. Now, at this point, it says that Vayera elav, Hashem appeared to him when he was in this area owned by Mamre, V'hu Yoshev, and this person was sitting, Pesach HaOel, at the doorway of his tent, Kachom Hayom, at the hottest part of the day. V'yasa einav, and he looked up, V'yar, and he saw. V'hine shlosha nashim nitzavim alav. There were 3 men standing by him. V'yar v'yaretz, and he saw them. V'yaretz, and he ran. L'krosam b'pesach ha'oel v'yishtachu arza. He saw them, and he called out to them from the doorway of his tent, and he bowed down to them. So, a number of questions we're going to have to come up and look at. Number 1, it says he saw here many times. Right, Vayera, the beginning of the parsha, and he appeared, right, similar word. Then it says that Vayisa einav, right, Abraham raised his eyes, right, to see, V'yar, and he saw, right. So here you keep having this idea, and then on the next line it says that these three men were standing, Vayera, and he saw, V'yaretz, and he ran after them. So he keeps saying that he saw. So why does it say it so many times? Because we know the rule. The Torah has no extra words, no extra sentences, no extra letters. So if it says something more than once, it's telling us a message. The next thing is, interestingly enough, it begins by saying, here it says, there's a nitzavim alav at the end of the second line into the first one. Nitzavim alav literally means they were standing on him. That's the literal translation. We can accept it as a colloquialism, as an expression, meaning that they were standing next to him. Right? Instead of meaning on him, it could be by him. They were standing next to him, and you see that line. But then, if we look later on, we find the same wording again. Let's see. You find the same wording, but in this case it reverses the who it's talking about, and it says, and he stood upon them the entire day. I'm just looking for the exact wording. Well, I'll tell you when we get to it, because that's also a question: is why it says that they were standing by him, and then later it says he was standing by them. Right? The men who were coming, were standing by Abraham. Then Abraham, later it says, was standing by them. But it's a funny word because it's a colloquialism. Like I said, it's not the true meaning of the word. The true meaning is they were standing on him, and when it says back, it was he was standing on them. That's the literal words. You could say that they were standing next to him. The Torah doesn't say that. So that's another question as to why it does that. So first, let's try to figure out what this is talking about. So here just so we have a concept, Abraham was just commanded by God to circumcise himself. Right? Now Abraham and all of the offspring of Abraham and everyone within his household are to be circumcised. This is where we get the mitzvah of circumcision. So Abraham is now just about 100 years old, and he circumcises himself. And on the 3rd day after the circumcision, the Talmud says is the most painful day following an operation. He's sitting at the entranceway to his tent in the heat of the day. If he had gone inside the tent, he'd be in the shade. He's sitting outside in the heat. And here he is in great pain after having a surgical procedure at the age of almost 100 years old. And that raises a question as to maybe the sanity of this person, but certainly, I would say more so, the personality of this person as to why is he doing this. And he begins by telling us that God appears to him as he's doing this. And then, as God is speaking to him, he then says, he looks out and he sees people coming, 3 men coming. Right? So he immediately stops his conversation with God to go talk to these 3 men. When he approaches the men, as we'll see, that he tells them right away in verse 4, let some water be brought and wash your feet and recline beneath the tree. I will fetch a morsel of bread that you may sustain yourselves. Then go on as much as you have passed. Right? So he tells them that he's bringing them water to wash their feet. Why is that? So the commentary is primarily Rashi, based on the Talmud, says that he wants them to wash their feet because he's concerned that they're idol worshippers. And idol worshippers, the one form of idol worship that was common among these people of this time was they worshipped the ground, the dirt, right? That, they have the expression, I love this person so much, I worship the ground he stands on. Worshipping the ground, today we can't imagine such a religion, but there was such a thing. So Abraham didn't want any type of idol worship to come into his home, so he would very politely tell them to wash your feet before you came in. And he says, I want to give you a morsel of bread. Right? As you're traveling, you have nothing to eat or drink, come on in, I'll give you a little bit of water and a little bit of food. That's what he says. Then suddenly things change, because they say to him, okay, we'll come. So it says, Abram hastened to the tent to Sarah, and he says, hurry, 3 sellers of meal, fine flour, knead and make cakes. Then Abraham ran to the cattle. He took a calf, and he gave it to the youth. And he tells him, slaughter the calf, and we're going to have tongue, right, so that we can serve this. Then he took cream and milk and the calf, and he puts it in front of them so they can eat it. So this is certainly not a morsel of bread, right? It's, somebody comes by in the street, you're passing by, let me give you a snack and something to drink. This is a major meal, right? He's killing an animal, slaughtering an animal, to cook an animal for them. He's giving them all types of food. And so why does he say that? He's only going to do this a little bit, right? But yet he does so much. Secondly is, you notice, this is a quick statement, that he serves the milk and meat at the same meal. Yeah, right? Now, of course, the Torah hasn't been given, and there is no responsibility for anyone to keep the Torah until the Torah is given. So, of course, they wouldn't have that knowledge. However, there's an interesting point. In the Talmud, it says that our forefathers understood the Torah. They understood it through their relationship with God, and they kept the Torah, even though they weren't required to. And therefore, it wouldn't have been that Abraham could give milk and meat to them. So how is it possible that he gave them milk and meat? So we understand, if you look closely, you see that it says he took cream and milk and the calf. That is, he gave them milk, and then he gave them meat. Now we know when we eat, normally, when you eat meat, you have to wait a certain amount of time before you have milk. In general, when you eat milk, you don't have to wait a certain amount of time before you eat meat. So what you're seeing here is that in the specifics of the sentence, it's telling you, are you concerned that Abraham gave milk and meat to these people? Because we know that he kept the Torah. So look at how the Torah writes it. It says cream and milk, and then it says calf. So first he gave them milk, and they ate that, and then they ate the meat, which would be permissible. Is certainly today even permissible as long as it's done in separate meals. And he put them before them, and then here it says, the last line on page 79, and he places before them, he stood over them beneath the tree and they ate. And there's the word again. Before we said, they stood by him, right, which really means they stood upon him. And now it says that Avram, right, omed alehem, he stood on them. Alehem is on them. So here you have them standing on him, and then later you have him standing on them. Both funny expressions, right? It's not what it means. It means that he was serving them. He stood and they sat. In the case before, right, they were standing because they were entering into his house, and he was seated because he was sitting at the gateway of his house, the entrance of his house. So it makes sense logically, but the Torah could have used words that say that. It doesn't. It's telling you a word that's not necessarily the best word. It's saying that he stood on them. That's not the best way of saying that they stood next to him. It's telling you another message. So we have to find out what these messages are. So let's see something else. Before we go on, there's also an idea here that Abraham was known that he was a Baal Chesed. He was a master of kindness. Whatever he did, he always did to take care of others. Because we understand from the Torah an important thing, which is important in our lives. The Torah tells us that really, probably the basic fundamental understanding of Judaism is that it is our job to emulate God. We're supposed to act like God. And God, it says in the Talmud, God is kind, so you should be kind. God feeds the hungry, you should feed the hungry. God clothes the naked, you should clothe the naked, right? God does these things. We should copy God. We should emulate God. God gives and does kindness to people. We also should give and do kindness to people. This is how you become godly. Not by sitting in a mountain contemplating the universe, but by doing good things for people, because that's what God does, and we emulate God. So Abraham wants to emulate God, that God goes and he takes care of everybody. So Abraham wants that he's sitting here in his tent, and he wants that as people are walking by, they're in the desert, they're hungry, they're thirsty. I want to invite them into my home, give them some shade, give them something to eat and drink, because that's what God wants me to do. That's how a Jewish person, that's how in his case, a monotheist, but eventually became Jews, that's how you're supposed to act. And therefore, that's the lesson we learn. In fact, the Torah begins by saying that God appears to Abraham. So God comes to visit Abraham because Abraham's sick. Just like we visit sick people, right? Here we learn God also visits sick people. So God comes to visit Abraham, and Abraham's having a talk with God. Now you can imagine, if you're on the spiritual level, to have this relationship with God, that God comes to talk to you. And then you see these three men who you think are basically idol worshippers. They're idol worshippers. And they're walking through the desert. And here you're talking to God. Now, would you interrupt your conversation with God to go talk to those idol worshippers? You'd think, certainly not. I'm talking to God. Right? That doesn't happen to people. Right? Abraham was on such a spiritual level that he could talk to God. But if God takes the time and he's going to talk to Abraham, a one-on-one conversation, you certainly don't say, oh, wait a minute, God, I got to go talk to these three guys. Would you mind closing the door? Thanks. These three guys who are walking by. It doesn't make sense. The point is as follows, that Abraham did just that. Abraham understood it's one thing to have a conversation with God, but it's a whole other thing to do what God does. God came to visit Abraham. We know God visits the sick. We should visit the sick. God takes care of the people, feeds them, gives them what to drink, takes care of the people. We also have to. So it's more important to take care of people than it is to have a conversation with God. That's what it's telling us. This is an important lesson for us as to how significant the way we act is. When we treat people nicely, we care for people, we do things for people, it's so significant that we even see that Abraham, who was on such an amazing spiritual level, he taught us that it's more important to do for people than it is to talk to God. So that's what we see here, right at the beginning. Now, he sees these three men who he thinks are idol worshippers, and that's why he gives them the water. And he brings them into his tent, and he says, I'm going to give you just a little bit of food, and come on in. In reality, he gives them a lot of food. Now, he does say a little bit of water, and he gives them only a little bit of water. But he says to them, I'm going to give you a little food, and he gives them an enormous meal. So from this we can understand also a famous Mishnah in the Ethics of Our Fathers, which says that a person should say little and do much. And how do you know a person who's basically a difficult person to deal with? That's a person who promises you everything, but he doesn't give you anything. And you'll sit down with somebody and they try to sell you something. Oh, sure, if you buy this from us, we have great service and we'll take care of you every time you come by, and you're like family to us. And then you find out after you bought it, they don't want to see you anymore. They have no interest in you because they've gotten their money. Now you're on your own. Now, that happens. The Mishnah in the Ethics of Our Fathers tells us a Jewish person does the opposite. A Jewish person is supposed to say a little. Don't make many promises, but you can do a lot. So Abraham says, listen, I'll give you a little bit of food. And he gives them an enormous meal because he wants to make promises he can keep, and he wants to do good for them, but he doesn't want them to feel that he's going to do a lot for them. He doesn't want them to feel indebted. Right? They'll be embarrassed. Here we have nothing. This man's giving us this big meal. He doesn't even know us. He says, oh, come in. I have some leftovers I'll give you. But that's not the case of what he does in the end. He gives them a nice meal because he wants to do good for them. This is also one of the reasons why it doesn't tell us who he is until the 6th verse. It just keeps calling him him. It doesn't call him by name. Abraham, the first time is, if you look in verse 6, so Abraham hastened. Up until that point, you don't see his name. And that's because when when he's being the host, right, we realize who is Abraham. Abraham is a prince. God says he's a prince. He's going to be the creator of nations. He's going to change the entire world. And he was an extremely rich and extremely successful and powerful person who dedicated himself to helping other people. And that's how he was going to change the world. But he didn't want people that came to him to think that it's the great Abraham coming to serve them, because people will feel sort of afraid to come. So you don't know who he is. He's anonymous. He's just a regular Jew, a regular person who you're coming to his house and he wants to do something for you. That's why he's there. So they don't tell you until they're already in the house and he's already serving them food who he is. Because until that point, he's just a regular guy. After that, they can know who he is. They're going to figure it out. But he doesn't want them to feel any type of fear or apprehension to go. So the Torah tells us that by not telling us his name until the 6th verse. And then so there's a couple of interesting points that we can speak about this outside rather than in the lines. So one thing we understand from here is that Abraham was in pain. He was in pain. He had surgery. It was the 3rd day of the surgery. The 3rd day of the surgery is the most painful of the times. If anyone who has surgery, you know that the 3rd day following the surgery is when the pain is the most intense. So here he is on the 3rd day. He's in great pain and he's sitting there. And God made it very hot, because it says he's sitting in the heat of the day. God made it hot so that no visitors should go through the desert, so that they wouldn't bother Abraham, because Abraham wants to help people. So God says, I'm going to make it so that Abraham can rest. I'm going to make it so hot outside that nobody's going to come, and that way he'll be able to rest. So Abraham doesn't know that, and he wants to help people, so he doesn't sit inside his house resting. He sits outside his house looking off into the distance for someone to come. God realizes it's not doing me any good to make it hot out, because he's standing in the heat and no one's coming. So he says, all right, I'm going to send 3 people. I'm going to let 3 people come. But in the reality is they're not people at all. We learn soon that they're angels, that God sent them, right? And they were angels. They're not human beings. They look like people. Abraham does not realize at this point that they're angels. He thinks they're people, which is why he tells them to wash their feet, because they could be idol worshippers. That's why he gives them food when angels can't eat, right? And nevertheless, God sends them. So there's a number of interesting points, because the first thing is this. If Abraham is sitting there and he's all upset because nobody's coming, right? And he's really bothered by this. He wants people to come. So God makes it so people should come. But here's the point. If Abraham is the kind of person that invites people into his tent all the time, so there must be people in the tent already from yesterday, right, who came the day before when it wasn't so hot. They were traveling through the desert. But today that it's so hot, just like nobody's going to leave and go to his tent, no one's going to leave his tent either, because it's too hot. So the fact is, he's got people there already. He has people in the tent. What's he so upset about? He's got the same people from yesterday. They're there today, so let's feed them. Why do you have to have new people? Right? So in other words, the whole story, I told you, it has a flaw. The flaw is, if it's too hot for people to come, it's too hot for people to leave. And if Abraham wants to do good for people, he's got people there. They're in his tent already from yesterday. So why is he so upset today that there's nobody coming when he's got people, because nobody's leaving? But so the lesson that we learn from this comes from a famous medrash. The medrash tells a story. It says, and when people would come to Abraham's tent, he would feed them these lavish meals, and they would learn how you're supposed to act, right? How a person acts. Then at the end, they'd say to him, thank you, I appreciate the meal, and they'll get up to go. And Abraham says, 1 second, you can't go. Why not? So you have to pray to God, to his God, our God. You have to pray. You have to thank him for the food. And so, well, I don't believe in your God. I believe in an idol. I believe in this. I believe in that. I'm not going to pray to your God. Abraham says, okay, I'm not going to coerce you. So then pay the bill. Here's the bill. He gives them an itemized bill for all the food they ate, and says, so you can pay the bill. So the people realize, well, I don't want to pay the bill. It's a lot of money, because here I am in the middle of the desert. You could imagine that water and cows and everything that he gives them is expensive, right? In the middle of nowhere. So it's a big bill. So they say, okay, we're going to pray to your God. Right? So the point is that Abraham wanted to not only feed people, and that's very important, and he wanted to take care of them, give them a place to rest, give them a place to cool off, give them water. He wanted to do that. But he also wanted to educate them about monotheism, that there is a God in the world, and that God expects things from you. And one of those is you have to come to the realization that God provided all this food for us. It's not me. Right? Sure, I might work for it, I might have acquired it, I might have money to buy it, but it all comes from God ultimately. So you have to thank God for this food, not me. So he teaches them that. So now to answer our original question about why he's not happy with the people who are there, is because, yes, he can feed the people who are there, and that's an act of kindness, but he's already convinced those people to be monotheists, because they already went through this routine with the meal and the bill, and they've already come to the conclusion that Abraham's correct and that they are monotheistic. And so he's saying, fine, I can still feed these people, but part of my job of opening people's eyes to the fact that there's one God in the world, and he's an ethical God, and he wants you to be ethical, I've already done that with them. I want different people now so I can still do it. And that's why he wasn't happy with the people who were still there. He wanted new people so he can not only feed them, but also educate them, which he couldn't do with the people he had already educated, because they were already educated. Right, so that's why he wasn't happy with the ones who were there. Now, as it goes on, why does it keep saying that he saw and he saw and he saw and he saw? Torah can tell you one time, Abraham's sitting there, he looks out, he saw the three guys coming, and he saw them, right? So why does it say he saw and then he saw and then he saw? The reason is because Abraham's goal here was to provide food, do chesed, acts of kindness for these people. Right? That's what he wanted to do. And but however, we know in our own lives that many occasions will arise when we are doing things. We want to do acts of kindness. We want to invite people for meals who need it. We want to give money to people who don't have enough money. We want to help people who are sick. We want to do it, but we don't see any. There aren't any around. I mean, how many Jews are there that are homeless in our area? How many Jews in our area can't buy food? From my efforts that we do every year, there are some, but it's not the norm, right? You don't find it a lot. You don't find a lot of people who are in need. So you might want to help people, but your neighbors aren't coming to you to ask and say, I need help. So the point is that sometimes you have to look to find things. I'll give you an example or two. And there's the founder of Isha Torah, his pictures of Rabbi Noach Weinberg, had a brother who was a teacher of mine, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg. And Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg was very accessible to the people in the community in Baltimore, where the yeshiva was, where I was studying. And one time a woman came to speak to him, and she asked a question. She says, she's a widow. Her husband had died. She had young children. And she said to him, Sukkot is coming, and it's necessary to build a sukkah. However, I'm a woman, and I'm not obligated to sit in a sukkah. I'm allowed to, but I'm not obligated. My children are under bar mitzvah. They also are allowed to, but they're not obligated. And while it might be a good thing for them to sit in a sukkah for educational purposes, fact is, it's hard. I mean, I'm a single woman raising a family. It's hard on many levels for me to have a sukkah. So she asked him, do I have to have a sukkah? Because I don't have to eat, and one of my kids don't have to eat them. There's no man in my house. So he said, well, the letter of the law is you don't have to have a sukkah. You're not obligated. You don't have to. If someone invites you out to a sukkah, you can eat in it, but you don't have to. And it says that the woman left, and then the next day, one of these prefabricated sukkahs, that you buy in a store, was delivered to her home, and he made the sukkah for her. And so somebody said to Rabbi Weinberg, they knew he did it. Right? The woman didn't know at first, but she figured it out. But the people knew it, and they asked him, "Why did you do that?" The woman didn't have to do it. She didn't have to eat in the sukkah. It's not an obligation. So why do you do that? She said, "Well, when she came and asked me the question, and her question was, do I have to eat in the sukkah because me and my children aren't obligated? So do I have to build one?" It told me that she doesn't have the money to build one. This is a woman whose husband died. She has her income, whatever it was, is, if not nothing, it's less. But her expenses haven't gone down. She still has children to take care of. So I realized that if I told her that it's a good thing to have a sukkah, which it is, she would buy it, but she doesn't have the money for it. And so I realized from that I'm going to find a sukkah for her, and he did. They tell a similar story with Rabbi Soloveitchik. Right? Rabbi Soloveitchik today, they were in New York and Boston, but the ancestors who were in Europe, there were famous rabbis by the name of Soloveitchik throughout history. But one of them, known as Rabbi Chaim, so was sitting one time, and he was also answering questions, and a man came in and he said, am I allowed to use milk at my Seder? Because I can't afford wine, and I don't have enough money for wine. So for my 4 cups, could I use milk rather than wine? So he told him, yes, you're allowed. If you don't have wine, you don't have access, you can't get, how are you going to fulfill the mitzvah of 4 cups? So yes, you could use milk. So then he leaves, and he tells his assistant, go to the store and buy food for this person, buy chicken and everything they need for the Seder. So his assistant says, well, how do you know he needs things for the Seder? He says, well, it's simple. The man asked me if he could serve milk. If he's serving milk, then he has no meat at his Seder. Right? But logically, you can't have milk and meat at your Seder. So if he wants to serve milk at his Seder rather than orange juice or something else for his 4 cups, so then he's not only telling me he can't afford wine, he really can't afford anything. He's not going to have a Seder. He's going to have matzah and milk. So go bring him what he needs for his Seder. The point being, in both of these cases, the common denominator is that the rabbi was looking. He didn't just listen to what they said, he thought about it, and he was looking for ways to help. In both cases, they found that these people needed it, but they weren't prepared to tell him. So he was able to help them. That's why it says he saw so many times. Because it wasn't that just Abraham saw them coming. He saw the need. He saw that there was a people who needed food, who needed drink, who needed a place to stay. So therefore, he didn't just see, but he looked, and he spent the time to integrate it, to think about what he was seeing, and to find ways to help. That's why I said for us, it's often very hard for us to try to find ways to help. But the truth is, it's not. It's just you have to be perceptive. You have to think, when you're talking to people, or you see people, and you see things, there are ways to be perceptive, to see. Because even when people come to me, they very rarely will tell me exactly what's going on. I usually have to find a way to get them to open up. They're coming because they want to tell me, but it's hard for them to tell me. So I usually have to find ways, and so with everyone. So what we're telling us here is that if you want to be like Abraham, who is like God, who helps people, it's not enough to just say, I want to do it. And if somebody would come to me and ask me for money, I'll give them money. If somebody would come to me and say they need food, I'll give them food. It's not sufficient. You have to be open and keep your mind open and your thoughts open to be able to realize there's people who need you who aren't going to necessarily tell you. But that's why it says that. Next, in this section, the final question to talk about is well, there's 2, because one of them I just raised, I didn't tell you. It says, remember I asked you before why it uses a funny expression that they stood on him and then he stood on them, right? That Savim Alav is the 3 men stood on him, and later it says that Abraham stood on them. So we now know that these were not 3 men, they were 3 angels. And of course they were on great spiritual heights. For them to be coming to Abraham, so they stood on him. That is, they were so great that they were like above him, is what it means. They're not literally standing on him, but they were above him spiritually. So it's like on a spiritual level, he had to look up to the angels, right? Because they were coming to him. However, when he invited them into his tent, and he gave them food, and he gave them drinks, and he took care of them, and he made sure that they had all of their needs taken care of, that made Abraham on such a great level, spiritual level, that he now is standing above the angels. He's now higher than angels. And it shows you the ability of how a human being who uses themselves to be kind to people and to help people, how that human being has the ability to raise to such a high level that they're higher than angels. So the Torah tells us first, the angels were greater than Abraham. They stood above him. But later it says he stood above them, but only after he fed them. Right? So that's where we learn the lesson, that the way of becoming great is through acts of kindness. Now, of course, you can ask me, what kind of a kindness is it? Because they don't eat. Angels don't have bodies. Right? He saw a body, right? As far as Abraham knew, it was like a hallucination. I mean, they were really there, but angels are not physical. Angels are the will of God. So they don't have a body. They don't eat. They certainly don't eat. Right? They don't eat. They don't drink. They don't get hot. They're not people. They're not physical beings. So why does the Torah tells us this whole story about how Abraham did all this stuff, and they didn't eat anyways? They didn't eat. That as far as Abraham knew, they ate. Like the commentaries say that they put it in their sleeve, or one commentary says that God made it possible for them to eat, even though normally they can't. But most people say that they tricked him. They hid the food so that he wouldn't know that they didn't eat. So then why, if the Torah is going to give us an example, you want to know about being nice to people, about feeding people, taking care of them? Here's an example. Abraham does it. And give us an example where the people benefit, where the people were hungry, and he fed them, and now they're not hungry. But But it doesn't. It doesn't give us an example where they're hungry. He gives us an example where they can't eat, where he doesn't do them any good at all. He doesn't help them. They weren't hungry, they weren't thirsty, they weren't hot, they don't go to sleep. So give them a place to sleep, give them food and give them drinks does nothing for them. So I understand God didn't want him to know that. But if the Torah is forever, is eternal, that means it's talking to you and me. We know that they're not eating. So give us an example in the Torah where Abraham, who hundreds of times did feed people, give us the example where he fed somebody. That's the example. That is going to be a perfect example for us of how a Jew is supposed to act. So the truth is, it is a perfect example, because we need to understand that the mitzvah of our feeding people is not welfare, like the government gives welfare. Welfare, the government would be very happy if there was nobody on welfare. If there was nobody who needed money. Everybody was doing fine. The government would be happy. A person who does chesed, who does kindness, they understand that they just want to do good. So if there's nobody who's hungry, then they'll look for someone who's tired. If there's no one who's tired, they'll look for somebody who's unhappy, somebody who doesn't have everything they need. They will continually look, because a person who does acts of kindness, our idea of it, is not doing it for the person. Even though it helps the person, they're doing it for themselves. We know that when we do an act of kindness for someone, we help them, and that's important. But really the benefit, more benefit comes to us by doing things for people than for them. It says in the Talmud that the giver of charity receives much more than the receiver of charity. And when you give money to a poor person, what you get personally, emotionally, and spiritually is much greater than that person got. He got $1. You got a mitzvah. You got a feeling of accomplishment. You've given. You are becoming a giver. You are emulating God. You're becoming a kind person. Right? It says the Chafetz Chaim was asked one time by a person. They could have 2 jobs in the bank. One job in the bank was that they handled small money. So someone would come in and they would just give out small amount of money, but a lot of it, and all the time. Another person, the other job he could have is where he was dealing with big amounts of money, but it didn't happen as often. Right? How often in a bank somebody comes in and needs a $50 million loan? That doesn't happen so often. But if someone comes in, needs to cash a check for $10, that happens all the time. So the Chafetz Chaim said, go to the person, you be the person who handles the small money. Because the more you give, the more often you give, the better it is for you. You become a giver. $50 million is more significant than 10,000 $10 bills. But if you want to be a giver, the more often you give, the more you become a giver. As you're doing it, more and more and more, it becomes who you are. And it's the same idea. Abraham was giving. It makes no difference if they benefited or not, because he wanted to benefit them. That was his intention. And that was the important act. We're not givers of welfare, right? Who we pray that nobody needs it. We're actors of acts of kindness. And if nobody needs food, then we do something else. We don't stop. So therefore, this is a perfect example that they give us an example of people who weren't people, who didn't have to eat. So that we should know that even if someone comes to your house and you invite them to eat a meal, and whatever reason they don't eat, you still did something. You gave. You gave them a feeling of friendliness, of warmth, of the ability to eat. Maybe they didn't need to. But even though you didn't feed them, it's as if you did. Right? Even though the angels that came to Abraham didn't eat, it's as if they did, because of what he did for them. It's really what he did for himself. Yeah.
But isn't, I understand what you're saying, but let's say you see a man on the street and he might be standing there for collecting money, right, for himself. There was a man at Sobeys, and people knew that he had money. Okay, more than one person told me that they knew who he was.
Okay.
And other people were still giving him money. They said, well, if he asks for money, I should give money. But isn't it that there's people who, and we know there's people who don't have money? Isn't it like today, let's say today, I'm saying, isn't it our responsibility to give money to people who really need it, too? Or
Certainly.
we're just doing it to make ourselves feel good, like
No,
that
I
the same
can't
thing?
tell you if that person had money or not, no matter what someone says. I have no way of knowing. But you do have a responsibility when you give money for charitable purposes, that it is for charitable purposes. So if a person has an illness and they think that they need money when they don't, or they're a criminal and they steal money by tricking you into giving them charity, that's wrong. And it's wrong for you to give them. That's not what I'm talking about, because there all you're doing is helping somebody sin, or helping somebody's illness to run their life. In the case of you have a reasonable obligation to verify that the person that you're giving money to needs the money. Reasonably. You don't have to chase them around the city and do a background check on everyone, but there are organizations that do that. Today, when people come to our synagogue during prayers, or they come to your door for a check, that they want money, they have to show you papers that prove who they are. If they don't have those papers, you don't give them, because anybody can get the papers legitimately, and if they don't have them, there's a reason they don't have them. So then you don't give. So those things happen. But our obligation is to help people. But it doesn't mean that that the person who's lying, they don't need our help, right? In this way, they don't need us to give them money. We're actually hurting them by giving them money. So that's not good. Because chesed, the idea of kindness, there's a rule, which is kindness has to be what's good for the person, not necessarily what the person wants. Like when you see a junkie downtown, right? a drug addicted person, and they ask you for money for food. Now, if you pretty reasonably know they're not going to buy food, they're going to buy drugs, right? So if you give them money, you're actually hurting them. You're not helping them, because you're assisting them to keep that drugs going, right? The addiction going. So you have to be careful that what you do is actually a kindness. You can have all kinds of things. You can have a kid who runs away from home and he's sleeping in the street. So you let him stay in your house because you don't want this nice kid to stay in the street. But maybe his parents want that he has to come home. That by 12 o'clock at night he's not going to want to stay out anymore. He's going to go home. But now he won't go home because you invited him in. Now, you don't have to investigate everything, but the idea is chesed, kindness, has to be what's good for the person, not necessarily what the person wants. When a person tells you they want a cigarette, right? Can you give me money for a cigarette? That's not good for the person. That is kindness, right? You are being kind. You are giving him the money for a cigarette, but it's not good. You're giving a drunk a drink. He'll feel better then, but you're hurting him. So that's not an act of kindness.
I have
Yes.
a question. If somebody doesn't want to work, and he said, we are too poor, and give us money. But I know one woman personally, she said, I would not work in any case scenario. I would not work at all, and she is asking everywhere for charity. Should we give her their charity? She is healthy, she can work.
Well, chances are somebody like that is ill. I mean, mentally ill.
She is absolutely okay.
It's pretty hard to believe. I mean, that's so demeaning. It's such a sick way of living that I can't tell you every case, but in general, a person who's like that usually is mentally ill, and there we not only we'd have a responsibility to see that they at least can live, but to try to help them. But in such a case where a person has the ability to work and just chooses not to, because today it's pretty hard for a person who has a residence to really go without food. I mean, the government does give you money. There is money for poor people. You're not going to be hungry. So therefore, if someone chooses not to, they're not going to starve to death. But if a person really is well, if the example you give me, I'll take it at face value, the person is well and is just saying, I don't want to work because I know people will give me money, so then you don't have to give them money.
Okay.
Right? But if they're not well, which most people who are like that have to not be well, because it's a demeaning life. There's got to be some reason that they're finding happiness in being like that. And then there are. That's why you have to verify when people ask you for money. There are people. I know there are people who are like that, who will not work when they can, or who will simply know that they can make more money begging than they can working. Right? So they'll do it. So those cases are sad cases, and you don't have to support all of those things. Just as examples. So let's move on a bit to some of the next parts. The next thing that happens, just on page 80 and 81, is now these three angels who now is coming to the conclusion that they're freaking out that they're angels. They ask Abraham right at the top here, where is Sarah your wife? Right? Where is she? In other words, they know that's how you know they're angels. Because if they're three Arabs going through the desert, they don't know him, they don't know his wife. So how could they ask for his wife by name if they don't even know him? They're just strangers. So of course we're starting to come to the conclusion there's something going on here. So they ask, where's Sarah your wife? And Abraham says, she's in the tent. And they says, well, I will come back to you at this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And it says, Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which is behind him. Now, the Torah gives us, now we leave the story, and now the narrator says, now Abraham and Sarah were old, well on in years. The manner of woman had ceased to be with Sarah. Sarah was post-menstrual. She couldn't have children. She was too old. Whatever medrash or idea you want to say about her, the fact was at the time when the angels came, physically she could not have children. And Sarah laughed, and she says, and I have withered, shall I again have delicate skin, and my husband is old. Right? Now, we stop there. The angels tell Abraham, that this is, your wife is going to have a baby. She hasn't had any children her whole life. She has problems getting pregnant from any one of a number of reasons, the Midrash says. And now, on top of it, she's now too old. Even if she could get pregnant earlier, which she hadn't, she's not going to now. She's past that time of her life. She's not going to have children. So she said. So she hears the angel say this, and she doesn't know who he is. She's in the other room. This guy comes into the house, and he says, "Where's your wife, Sarah?" Okay, it's over there. She's going to have a son this time next year. It's like I walk up to you in the street and I say, you're going to win the lottery. Well, you think, well, who are you to tell me I'm going to win the lottery? What are you, some crazy person walking around the street saying that. You don't really believe you're going to win the lottery just because I told you that, right? So here, the next thing is that God says, why does Sarah laugh, saying, I shall truly bear a child, though I am old? Right? So, why should she believe him? She said, if God said it, okay, but some Arab coming in off the desert and walking around, an idol worshiper says it, I should believe him. The next thing is that it seems that God's lying, because I just told you what Sarah said. Sarah says that, am I going to have delicate skin? In other words, when the hormones, right, when she went post-menstrual, affected her skin. She got wrinkled, her skin was different. No, she says, am I going to become a young girl again and I'm going to have children? Like, is that what you're telling me? She's making fun. She says, not only that. Oh, right, so you make me a young girl? My husband's 100 years old. He's going to give me a child. He couldn't give me a child when he was 40. He's going to give me a child when he's 100? And that's what she says. So God says to Abraham, why is Sarah laughing? And she says, I'm going to have a child because I've gotten old. But that's not what she said. She said, my husband is old. She didn't say, I'm old, right? So God changed it. He didn't tell Abraham what she said. He says, she said this, but she didn't say that. So everybody asks, why is it that God does not say what Sarah really said? He changes it. And God is truthful. There's nothing God says that's not true. Why would he do that? Now we see this in a number of places in the Torah. We're not at that yet, but we've done this before. You have Yaakov, whose mother tells him, go tell your father you're Esau and get the blessings of Esau. But he's not Esau, right? You have many occasions where it appears that our forefathers are lying. Right? Here you actually appears that God is lying. So how is that possible? So that's the reason that we have this question is because we don't understand the law about lying. See, if you look at the Torah it tells you don't steal, don't murder, right? That means don't murder, don't kill somebody, right? As murder, right? It's one thing in war. We're not talking about war. Don't kill somebody, don't murder someone, don't take somebody's wife, don't steal their things. That's very black and white. Don't do it, right? When it talks about lying, it doesn't say that. It says, from a lie, you should distance yourself, which means you shouldn't lie. But it doesn't say don't lie. And from this, the Talmud teaches us that lying is different. You're not supposed to lie in a way that benefits you. In other words, you asked me yesterday, would you, go to the bank and cash this check for me? And I forgot. So today you come, did you cash the check? And I'll say, I went to do it, the bank was closed. Why am I lying? Because I don't want to get in trouble. So I'm not allowed to do that. Right? That's a lying that Torah forbids. But how about if you come and you ask your husband, does this dress look nice on me? And it makes you look terrible. I mean, objectively, it looks terrible, right? So should he tell you, no, it looks nice? No, he should tell you the truth, because you're going to get embarrassed, right? But how about if the dress, in his eyes, doesn't look so good, but it's not objectively ugly, it's just he doesn't like it. So, and he knows that if he tells you that dress is nice, you're not going to wear it. That means that all of the money and all of the time that you put into it is a waste. You're never going to wear the outfit now because he said that. So in that case, the Torah allows him to lie. The Torah says, not in the case where it's really going to embarrass you, but in a case where it's his personal preference, he says, you know, it's very nice. It's a beautiful outfit. And he's lying. Why does it allow it? Because it's for your benefit. When it comes to you, me lying for you, and so that you should have dignity, you shouldn't get embarrassed, but then you're allowed. Right? For in fact, for shalom bayis, for having peace between husband and wife, you're allowed to lie. Right? If like if I was counseling you, there are times when I'll exaggerate in order to that your husband and wife should be closer together. In order, right, for that reason, I'll say, well, you know, when you weren't here, your husband was telling me how much he misses you, and he might not have done that. But by my telling you that, it makes your affection stronger. Did I hurt anything? No. Do I benefit from it? No, I don't benefit. You benefit, then I'm allowed to do it.